Broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Hello, everyone. This is Marion Walsh. I am an attorney with Littman Krooks, and I have been working with Rockland Community College for at least 5 or 6 years now. And I'm giving this presentation on the legal rights of students with disabilities in the post-secondary environment and finding the supports to foster success. As noted, I'm a partner with the law firm of Littman Krooks. We represent parents and students in advocacy and litigation to ensure that students with disabilities have the right to both a free, appropriate public education in public schools, and we also do some advocacy and help with college advocacy. We also work under the IDA, Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, and 504 and the ADA in the college environment. So I am here to give you some background on the very important things that parents and students need to know about the transition to the post-secondary environment from high school. This is a really important time, and right now in 2020, it's compounded by the pandemic and the shift to predominantly remote learning. So I'll talk a little bit about that, but I really sympathize with parents right now and students on this very difficult time in education. I'm also a parent. I have a son right now in college who is doing remote learning, and I understand the challenges. And I have 3 older children who have gone through college. So I really commend you all for being here, for being committed to this. I commend your students for persevering, and we are all going to get through these challenges. Now, in general, I'm just going to be talking about the legal background, which is applicable both in the pandemic and non-pandemic setting. The transition from high school to post-secondary education to college necessitates really a mind shift. And we really have to think about any advocacy shifting from the parent to the student. The student is an adult now. Even if your child is not 18 yet, they are considered still, to some degree, an adult in the college environment. The college will treat them like an adult. And indeed, most students who do attend college are 18, and a few will be turning 18 perhaps in the fall. So as an adult, your child has the autonomy and the legal standing to be their own advocate. You do not necessarily have the right to step in to advocate if they don't consent. So that is a challenge. It's a very significant challenge for parents, and it's also a challenge for students, because students often don't have the skills to be self-advocates and don't even often recognize the need, and many do not want, for example, special help, special accommodations. They may be in denial. So there is a lot of work to be done there. There's also a change in the support system from the high school environment to the college environment. We'll talk a little bit about that as we move on. So what changes? In the college environment, there is a new eligibility criteria for services, which means that the whole shift in the law changes on when a student is eligible for accommodations. In high school and in middle school and elementary school, students with disabilities often had an individualized education program. That's the IEP. And each year, if a student has an IEP, the Committee on Special Education has an affirmative duty to meet each year and an affirmative duty to develop a working plan for that child. And that does not happen in college. There is no obligation for a college to identify students or to have a meeting each year. And it's only when the student initiates it. So, and there's also a shift in self-direction of services. Again, the young adult has to initiate and direct the services in the public school environment before college. The Committee on Special Education directs the services, and the student may be a participant, but they don't always have to be. And once the student is 18, an adult, the parents are no longer part of the process. They're not going to be apprised of process unless the student chooses to include them. And that's even true if the parents are paying for the student's education. You will not automatically get bills. You will not be notified. If you call, they may not, even in the Office of financial services, they may not speak to you. And we're going to talk about some of the technicalities on that, how you can get that access. However, in general, the default for colleges is that the student is the adult here. This is their education, and they have to access it. And remember, for public school education up to high school graduation, there is a legal entitlement to a public school education. That is not true in the college environment. It's not an entitlement, and that changes the legal status, and it changes also the way colleges address and approach students with disabilities. So those are some of the changes which we're going to talk about in more detail in the presentation. So just the background of the law, which I've just alluded to a little bit. Section 504 and the ADA, again, only protect elementary and secondary and post-secondary students from discrimination. The IDA only goes through the school year when the student turns 21 or graduates. So there's no more IEP. Again, the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, which is the law that requires districts to develop the IEP, is no longer in effect once a student graduates or the year they turn 21. So in high school, Section 504 does require a school district to provide a free appropriate public education with accommodations, and that's if they don't have the IEP. But remember, after high school, even under 504, the school district is not required to provide that free appropriate public education. So there's no more obligation of a free appropriate public education in college. It's an obligation for appropriate accommodations and not to discriminate. And that's only if the person discloses and accesses it. So it's very different. What is covered? The college post-secondary school is only required to provide appropriate academic adjustments, or there could be social emotional accommodations as well for those needs as necessary to ensure it does not discriminate on the basis of disability. And that key is discriminate. There has to be a level playing field. There's no obligation generally for affirmative services. Okay. So that is the legal background right now, and it's very important to note, and that is explained very well on the Rockland Community College website. There's a chart there, just you can take a look at that as well, and you can always go to the Office of Disability Services if you have any questions. Very good there. So again, now we're just going to talk about some other laws that give some background on, particularly on privacy and access. The Family Educational Rights and Privacy Act of 1974, it's an important law that both gives you access to records and protects privacy. And in HIPAA, we call HIPAA the Health Insurance Portability and Accountability Act of 1996, again, both protect an individual's privacy, and they also require either a healthcare entity or a school, if it receives federal funds, to give parents access. And just remember, these rights of access and privacy transfer to the student at 18 years of age. Now, I hope you've all done this, but please ask your child or young adult if they're willing to please sign a FERPA and HIPAA waiver so you may obtain records and speak to school or hospital staff. And I'm going to talk a little bit about this after, but we also recommend having a power of attorney done with these consents embedded in it and signed separately, because this is very important, because whether or not your child has a disability or not, unless you have guardianship, which is very unlikely if your child is going to college, it's possible, but unlikely. If there's not a signed form, HIPAA waiver, so that your child gives you access to records, you will not be able to access those records in general. And if even in kind of a worst case scenario, if your child is in a car accident and is unconscious, the hospital may not tell you your child's status unless you can show that there's a consent, because this is meant to protect the individual's privacy. There have been some cases, for example, where a young adult, for example, had was pregnant, or a case where a young adult had a drug overdose, and the person did not want their parents to know. And when the hospital tells the parents, there have been lawsuits against that. So just keep that in mind, that your young adult has privacy rights and may actually, if they don't consent, or in the unfortunate and sad case of incapacitated, they may not you may not be able to have access. So just make sure you have those HIPAA, FERPA, and HIPAA waivers signed. And they should be on the RCC website, and you can always ask for that. And if your child won't sign a FERPA waiver, then you'll have to have a conversation. And we'll talk about those next steps on what to do. Okay. So these are just some general legal requirements regarding services on college campuses. The ADA does require schools at all levels, whether public and private, to provide equal access to programs, services, and facilities to both students, employees, and members of the public, regardless of disability. And to ensure this accessibility, they have to follow requirements on new construction, alterations, renovations, academic programs, and other practices and procedures. Now remember, the ADA and 504 do not just cover, obviously, physical construction. That means they mean your child has to have access to instruction, and it's very important in this remote environment that there are accommodations and anything needed for access to the remote environment. Because if their student has hearing issues, for example, has difficulties with even executive functioning, there must be a way that a child can, not a child, this is your adult, the adult can access this. So, so there does have to be accessibility on all levels. Okay, so we're going to shift to a new topic now. That was a lot of background on some of the laws that apply and what colleges do and don't have to do in the transition. And I mentioned at the beginning that the qualifications in college are different than they are in the public school environment. So remember, in the public school environment, the criteria for having an IEP is if the child has a disability in 13 or more categories that has an impact on educational performance, and that, again, meets the criteria of the IDA, and the child needs special education services. Now, under 504 and the ADA in college, you are considered to have a disability if you meet at least one of these three conditions. You have a documented physical or mental impairment that substantially limits one or more major life activities. Or you have a record of such impairment, or you are perceived as having such an impairment. So we can just unpack those a little bit. A documented physical or mental impairment. In general, colleges are going to want some documentation of a physical disability or a mental, I don't like to call it a mental disability, or a disability that affects cognitive functioning or emotional functioning. So, so you should, when the child is applying for services, if you have not done this already, you can bring an IEP, bring neuropsychological evaluations, bring district evaluations, bring a doctor's note, and that will show the child that the young adult has a disability. I'm using the term child loosely only because this is your child, I understand that, but general, if I use the term child, I'm still talking about the young adults. And now the disability does have to substantially limit, and the IDA doesn't define that, one or more major life activities. Major life activities are very broad. They can be breathing, thinking, running, concentrating, reading, mathematics, anything that there's a major life activity that it's very unlikely to be struck down on that basis. However, substantially limits is not defined by the ADA, and some courts have given it kind of a stricter meaning than you may think. So it's that word substantially can be a little tricky. But in any event, it's likely that if you're here and listening to the webinar, your child has already been qualified. But if they have not, make sure you do get some notes from the doctor and some documentation that does show that physical and mental impairment. Having a record of such impairment would also be the record from school, history of IEPs, history of 504s, the evaluations, and even being perceived as having such impairment can protect an individual. And remember, I'm going to talk about mental health a little later, but this depression and anxiety can be mental impairments that affect learning. Okay, so moving on to the next area, the standard the college has for providing adjustments and providing academic adjustments, the college does not have to lower or substantially modify essential requirements. So if a student has certain assignments to do, it's not that the college is going to modify them, or they're not going to necessarily even modify attendance requirements, but individual professors may decide to give some accommodations on students, for example, be able to turning in things late. Unlike high school, it's unlikely that papers will be excused as far as modification. It's unlikely that the work will be modified or diluted, because the college does have to show when a person gets the degree that they did meet the standard for academics. So they don't not have to make adjustments that fundamentally alter the nature of a service, program, or activity, or that would result in an undue financial administrative burden. So just to keep that in mind, because it is a different standard than what high schools have. And as far as services and what is considered an adjustment, a college does not have to provide personal attendance, generally individually prescribed devices, readers for personal use or study, or other devices or services of a personal nature, such as tutoring or typing. So unlike in high school, for example, where a student could perhaps have a one-to-one teaching assistant who could help work and modify material, that a college does not have to provide that one-to-one individual. They could accommodate a student wanting to bring in someone possibly to write notes, but that's a different issue, and they could accommodate a student who needed to use a particular service and bring it in themselves, for example, some particular device. However, they're not going to provide the devices, unlike a high school is obligated to do. Okay. So the steps on applying for the adjustments, if you haven't done this already. So remember, when your child, I believe your children have already been identified, but if your child has not been identified, you have to come forward, or the student rather has to come forward to say that they have a disability and show the documentation. The college may require a student to follow reasonable procedures to request academic adjustments, and that's what I mean by notifying the college and providing the documentation and asking for what is needed. The student is responsible for knowing and following these procedures, and they will be, once they're registered with the Office of Disability Services, they will be getting emails, and it's their obligation to follow through. It's their obligation each year to renew this, or even possibly each semester. And the college will include information on the procedures and context for requesting academic adjustments. And of course, Rockland Community has a wonderful staff and administrators who will assist students with disabilities. But the hardest part of this, which I have found, and which is almost, I wouldn't say universal, not for every student, but it's a significant problem, is that the students do not want to reach out. The students do not want to feel stigmatized. And many students will feel, I'm fine now, I got through high school, I don't want an IEP, they're not going to have an IEP in college. I know I don't want anything to do with that. I'm going to be fine. I just want to do this on my own. And that can be a real issue, because the college, the student's not going to be on the college's radar. And many students are not prepared for the rigor of college. It is different than high school, and the monitoring is different, and the level expected is different, especially in this remote environment. But I think it is a wise decision when you're with your student to really sit down and ask your student to locate the procedures and ask the school officials, such as admissions, it would be mainly the Office of Disability Services. So again, we talked about this a little, and the documentation will be diagnosis of current disability, supporting information, the date of the diagnosis, how the diagnosis was reached, and credentials. And it's a very good idea to have a neuropsych. That was done in the past. Just 3 years. So it's really important to, if you can, to have that evaluation. If you have evaluation from the district in the last 3 years, that's great. But if you don't have a neuropsych in the last 3 years, it may be a good idea to have one, or at least a letter from the doctor. And you will need information on how the disability affects a major life activity and how it affects academic performance. And if you can't get the neuropsych, I would recommend getting a letter from the parent therapist or provider your child is working with. And the request should be made earlier if possible, and you can request adjustments at any time, even if you meet the college's, you don't meet the college's deadline. They will want you to comply by a certain period. You can always come forward if you haven't to ask for different adjustments, or if you haven't provided it, to get the information in. For example, some students may at the beginning of the year say, no, I don't want to do this, I don't need adjustments, I don't want to have recognized that I have a disability, I don't have a disability anymore, but then realize as the semester progresses that I do need help, and then they would need to come forward. However, it is much harder at that time, particularly if the student, young adult, is starting to fail courses and has missed things. It's very hard to come out of that hole. It's much better to be proactive and get it at the beginning. Not that this is going to guarantee success, that just because you disclose and accommodate, it will not. However, it will make it easier to get the needed accommodations that the student needs. And just to keep in mind, if you need additional documentation or evaluation, if you want to have that neuropsych and you can't afford it, the college is not required to pay for a new evaluation to document disability and for academic adjustments. But it's just very important to note that. I say that to the school district because it is possible in some cases, if you have a denial of fate from the school district as compensatory services, to ask the school district to give a new neuropsychological evaluation, but that is going to require, in all likelihood, an impartial hearing and something against the school district. But we're really talking about if the child needs a new evaluation in general, it's going to be the parents or students' responsibility to obtain that. And it is possible, there are some neuropsychologists who do take insurance. It is possible to get a good evaluation without a significant expenditure, because they can run from $5,000 to $7,000 or more. So just to keep that in mind. But it can be really worth it just to have the college so the college can have it on file. So we're going to switch to a new topic now, jumping around a little bit. And often this is where we have questions come in from the audience. I'm sorry I can't meet with you in person. But you can always, as I noted, reach out to services at RCC, and they are excellent there. I have a very good relationship, and I've been very impressed with the work that they're doing. This is student mental health needs have, for the past at least the past decade, I'd say, or even more so in the past 5 years, and even now more so in COVID times. We have a real crisis, and suicide is right now, and has been for at least the past few years, the second leading cause of death in the United States for young people ages 10 to 24, and that's from the CDC statistics. And a lot of mental health needs come to the forefront in college around that age. And unlike in a public school district, college staff do not have the obligation, unlike in public school districts, to identify mental health needs or stresses. And sometimes the only sign that you may see, or the college may see, of mental health needs is just extreme isolation or withdrawal. For example, if the young adult stops going to classes, or just shuts down, or just stays inside. And in COVID, that's even harder to see because everyone has been isolated. I know, my son is in college, has been isolated since March, and he's going to keep remoting. So he does talk to people online. I can see that he's engaged, and he laughs on the computer, but he would appear isolated because he doesn't leave the house due to COVID, and still doesn't, because he's gotten into this routine. And it's just a different environment we're living in, and just unanticipated. But in any event, there are signs of mental health conditions that apply both in COVID and not in COVID times. If the student is withdrawn, I'm not a psychologist, but I know the signs. I'm on the board of NAMI, and I've done a lot of work with students, so I know that there's any kind of stated intent to hurt oneself, if there's extreme differences in sleeping and eating, if there's any significant change in behavior, any anger you see, you should, with your young adult, ask them to get help or suggest help. In a college environment, students have to self-identify and seek help. There is a counseling center and counseling is available, but again, students must seek it out. Unless there's a real crisis there, no one's going to come to the student and say, oh, you haven't, we'd like to provide you counseling. No one would do that. The students have to go and seek it out. It can be very difficult for a student who is depressed or student in crisis to reach out because it's a vicious cycle. The more depression sinks in, the worse it becomes, the more isolated the person comes, the less likely they are to seek help. And then they're going to also be resistant to help. So I've seen this happen frequently, and it's very hard to see what's going to change it, but it has to be a constellation of both the student, reaching out to some degree, the support being available, the support being appropriate, the parent approaching the student in the right way. There's a lot of things, the right evaluations, the right services. Things can get better, but sometimes things, do get to almost a crisis before they get better. So for parents, please speak to your child about mental health services and show them the office. And the student should know what to do if he or she becomes overwhelmed. And it's easier said than done, I know, but at least if you provide the resources and don't make it, there's no stigma involved in this. If you have a mental health condition, it's like having a cold, it's like having the flu. It's like any physical illness. And if you don't get help, you may not get better. There is treatment. So it's important to note. So the counseling at Rockland Community College, there is both counseling and crisis intervention. So students who are facing personal problems, who are feeling emotional or experience a crisis can see a counselor both confidentially, will be confidential. What can be short-term or could be longer-term. And then, it's likely right now, because most colleges are a little bit overwhelmed with the counseling, that it may, if your student needs more help, the counseling service may refer them off campus, which is fine. But it's good to have a place to go, and some of the counseling centers should offer drop-in services as well. So make sure, again, when you're talking about the mental health services for your student, make sure you also tell them about the counseling that's available. And I'm not sure, I believe right now it's probably remote, but there's a protocol for remote counseling. And if there is a mental health crisis when the counseling center is closed, or if the remote counseling is just not working and there is a crisis, you should call 911, or your student should call 911. And there is also the Rockland County Behavioral Health Response Team. There's a number here on the site, 845-517-0400 for immediate assistance. And it's important to note that, and also it's important to make sure your student knows if they feel like this, that they should always call you as well, that you're not going to judge this, that you are just here to help. And students will not want to have this conversation, but I think it's important for everyone, because anyone could be susceptible to a mental health condition, particularly in these difficult times. And I think it's important to have a conversation before. And just for students who are more addressing issues related to personal growth and development, more longer term, there can be individually counseling available, and there are small group workshops and special programs that are offered throughout the semester. So, but again, your child has to access that. And a lot of young people it can be very complicated, because unfortunately there is still often a stigma with mental health, and a lot of individuals will have the need and then maybe start a group but get bored and not want to go anymore. And it's really important, to the extent possible, to stick with these programs so they don't really work well. You have to be persistent, because programs are overwhelmed also, and may not get back to a student on appointments all the time, or will not follow up if they don't attend. So you have to be both persistent and willing to keep going. And a lot of students just don't have that. They have a lot going on in college, but it can be very important. So just make sure you have a conversation with your child, your student, and you should know, and they should know what's available as resources. Okay. So again, switching from mental health now, and I know you can look at the Counseling Center and RCC. There's a lot of great resources just on that website. So parents, make sure you look at it, make sure your student knows about it. Back to what adjustments colleges have to provide, because it's often a cycle. We talked about mental health before, but there's often a cycle that student may be okay, emotionally, but then if they're work becomes too much, it just becomes too much to go, they stop going to class, start failing courses, then it does become, severe stress and could trigger then, depression or anxiety, because there is a, legitimate reason, an objective reason, and it gets to be a cycle. So it's important to focus on these academic adjustments. Also just for your student success in college. So there are some adjustments. There could be aids and services, slight modifications to academic requirements that are necessary just for educational opportunity. It's not going to be, not having papers due, but there could be a way that the student could show competency without full paper, but that's going to really be up to the professor individually. And parents, colleges really don't want parents to contact professors directly, and they really would rather the student reached out even to the dean. But if you have to reach out to the dean, to someone, it would be to the administrator, not to the professor, and you would have to have the student's consent. And you could ask for a meeting, and the student would have to be at the meeting or consent to the meeting. If you ask for a meeting and your student says, no, I don't want you to meet, the dean is not going to meet with you. They'll meet with the student. So there can also be accommodations for withdrawing from a class rather than failing, or even some classes may have a pass-fail option. Some examples of some adjustments, if needed, arranging for priority registration, reducing the course load. So this is all better done at the beginning of the year. Remember, once you get to the end of the semester and all of a sudden the student has not been to class and is failing, has not turned in any assignment, it's going to be very hard then to ask for an adjustment or even a withdrawal, because there's a deadline for withdrawal. So it's much better to look at this early on. Providing note takers, recording devices, that's allowing them, not providing them necessarily. Sign language interpreters, extended time for testing. We're not really talking about dorm rooms right now, but in RCC is commuter school, but that can be in other colleges. And then there can be equipping school computers with screen reading, voice recognition, other adaptive software or hardware. And in a remote environment, you can ask your student what accommodations they need for learning. If there's, look at the evaluations, look at the students' needs, and look at how they've done with remote learning in the past. What do they need to succeed? And is it something that the college can do as accommodation, or something you have to do privately? But you can always ask the college, and they can point you in the right direction. Okay? And in general, a school can't charge students with disabilities more for participating in programs than it charges students who do not have disabilities. However, they don't have to pay for necessarily all the adjustments that the student may need in college level. And remember, there's a lot of services that are generally available in college, not just for students with disabilities. That can be a very important resource. But again, your student has to access them. There's, generally a math lab, writing center that would help with writing, career services, office hours with professors, academic advising, health services, library, counseling. And a lot of this is remote now, but it is there. And it's important for your student to know how to access it. Writing is, for example, a lot of colleges will have a writing center and let the students turn in their papers before they're turned in and give comments, which is extremely helpful. Okay. Again, the students have to identify the need for those general services and seek help, and they're going to be centered on benefiting all students and not individually tailored for students with disabilities and not really monitored. But it is important still that your student can access these, reach out for these services if needed. Other basic accommodations on campus, these are just some basic ones that your student may need: extended time breaks and examinations, course substitutions, reduced course load, a scribe reader, note takers, or course material in an alternative format. It's just taking a break here into a new section on what if the adjustments are not working. Who should cooperate with, of course, with the college, speak with the Section 504 coordinator, the ADA coordinator, the Disabilities Services coordinator, all who coordinate the school's compliance, and speak to them first about what your student needs. But again, your student should be reaching out first, and you're only going to be able to reach out with your student's consent. So this presentation is geared toward parents, but it's important to go over this again with your child, with your student. And just to keep up some grading, students should understand what their grading options are and ask early on, not at the end of the semester when it's already late. Now, more so, a lot of colleges are asking, giving students the option to pass fail, especially with remote instruction, but there's often a deadline for this. And not all schools will, not all classes will offer it, but you have to meet that deadline, or you can't at the end of the semester after you have a D in the course say, oh, I really wanted to take that pass fail. You do have to meet that deadline. So the student should consult with the advisor or the instructor, and there are set rules for filling out certain forms. Students can audit a course without necessarily receiving a grade if it's something they just want to experience. And now there is also an option for rather than failing a course, never attended can be by an instructor when a student has never attended but has failed to officially drop the course. And that's just an option to know about if your student has not been able to attend a certain course. Okay. Also, there's measurable progress. That's a grade to show that sufficient progress has been made that they can complete the requirements. And there is a difference from a withdrawal and failing. So if a student, say, for example, is in a course and just stops going and doesn't take the exams or fails the exams, they will be getting an F on the transcript. But if they withdraw by a deadline, they will not be getting an F in the course. So there is, again, make sure your student understands and reviews those deadlines, because it's much better to have a W on a transcript than it is to have an F. And it is possible to seek a retroactive withdrawal, but it is more complicated. It has to be through a set process with possibly even a grievance process. So, so just keep that in mind. It is more complicated. And there is also the option for an X grade. At RCC, this when I last checked on it, but make sure these are updated and make sure your student knows about these options. I remember every student thinks everything is going to go really well in college, and they should be. That's good. They're optimistic, but also just know that this is, again, a rigorous process, and know what's out there and what the student needs to do, just if things become difficult. They need to switch courses and that they know the deadlines. Okay. So these are just some more grading options and flexibility, late withdrawal appeals, retroactive withdrawal appeals, and repeated courses. So look on the website. I'm not going to go over these in detail because these are listed on the RCC website, and it's important for your student to understand the options and for you to understand also. And as far as you monitoring your student in college, that's really going to be up to the student, how much your child wants you to be involved, because if they don't want you to, you can't. It's hard to force it. You can set, maybe have monthly meetings or weekly meetings. Monthly may be too much, but remember, this is your child's education, and it's possible if they're not ready for college, you may want to have that conversation, or they may find out that they're not, and that is, it sounds terrible, but it's also not the worst thing. If they fail and then come back later, that is not the worst thing to learn, because they're not going to have you around their whole lives, in a job. Parents can't be involved. So they're going to have to learn to stand on their own 2 feet, to be self-advocates, to be as an educated individual. They're going to have to learn to navigate these complex policies, complex rules, and that's part of unfortunately right now education. So just keep that in mind. Now, if things don't go well, college, there is the obligation for the college to have grievance procedures, and students may initiate a grievance if you think there's discrimination, or you think that something wasn't addressed properly, and the college will advise you on the website the steps you have to follow to start the grievance process, and they're both formal and informal processes. But again, the first step is calling and talking to the Office of Disability Services, and it's on the website, and to also make sure your student understands the process. And if you use the grievance process, be prepared to present all the reasons that support your request in a set out complaint. Okay. There's also the opportunity, if you're dissatisfied with the outcome of a grievance, to take action. You can file a complaint for discrimination with the Office of Civil Rights or in a court of law, and there is a set time period of this, I believe. So make sure there are deadlines. So just keep all that in mind if needed. Now, the college really may not be able to do everything for your student. As noted, they aren't obligated to provide affirmative services. So it is possible for you to look into, if your student agrees, to look at supports that your student may need, and that can be privately paid for. The school will not pay for those. So there are private, maybe a private therapist covered privately or with insurance. There are executive functioning coaches for ADHD, and they do meet remotely depending on student needs. There can be content tutoring, social coaching, guidance. There may even be guidance and accessing services on or off campus. And then there could be, assistance with picking classes, emailing professors, one-to-one coaching. So there are services available, and it's actually, it's better if the student, of course, the student has to be on board with this and initiate it. And there's also, but it can be helpful if the parent is involved, if the parent is not involved, because it's better to have someone else outside, even though you have to pay for it, than to have the parent involved, because there's so much emotion tied into it. So I really can't take questions right now. I wish that I could be there in person, but remember, you and your student, your child are a partnership, but the partnership is changing, and your student is now taking the lead. So I wish you all the best in this transition. And I also encourage you to reach out to me if you have any questions. Our office can help right now with advanced directives, which is what every 18-year-old needs, just to make sure, as I noted, that there's a power of attorney, that there's the healthcare directive, healthcare proxy, and it's just something that every adult should have, just so someone else can step in if incapacitated. But you can always contact me, and I wish you all the best and success with your year in this very challenging COVID time. Okay, thank you, and thank you for RCC for having me. I really appreciate it, and feel free to stay in touch, okay? Thank you so much. We can end this now, and appreciate it. Bye-bye.